Command called it a suicide mission. The pilot called it impossible, but Staff Sergeant Maria Santos called it another Tuesday. With 23 soldiers stranded and snipers waiting for dawn, every second counted. The Blackhawk sat grounded with a shredded fuel line and half its armor missing, but Maria made a choice no protocol would ever approve. Pulling fuel lines from a damaged Chinook and armor from a Humvee door, she jury-rigged a solution that shouldn't have worked. By dawn, her creation would defy both physics and the enemy's expectations. Everyone celebrated the pilot's skill few, knew who truly saved the day. The Black Hawk sat in the maintenance bay, battered, and silent rotors drooping, its fuselage scarred by shrapnel and gunfire. Pooled oil and hydraulic fluid formed dark stains beneath the aircraft, dripping steadily from ruptured lines. Captain Maya Harrington's boots echoed as she paced nearby, her eyes fixed on the broken helicopter. Every minute brought Alpha Team closer to disaster, trapped in a ravine with dawn and enemy snipers approaching. Maria Santos crouched beside the left skid, eyes tracing the damage. Years of crew chief training ran through Maria's mind. Armor gone below the fuel cell, dual fuel lines severed at the junction, tail rotor cables shredded to threads. She spotted the outdated countermeasures pod, its casing dented and circuitry exposed, a reminder that this supply transport lacked the advanced systems of frontline birds. Standard depot repairs would take days. She had 45 minutes. A jagged hole yawned where the starboard armor should have shielded the fuel tank. Maria's finger caught on the edge, feeling the crescent tear where RPG shrapnel had sliced clean through the composite plating. The helicopter's paint was blistered, bullet holes peppered the doors, and the rear rotor linkage hung at an awkward angle. Around her, the hangar's scrap heap offered little hope. 3 downed aircraft, already stripped of most valuable parts by earlier emergencies. Chief Warrant Officer Garcia's shadow stretched over the Black Hawk's battered frame. "Command says, write it off," he said, nudging a twisted panel with his boot. "They're prepping airstrikes on Alpha Team's position figure. It's better than capture." His voice was flat, resignation etched in every word. Maria wiped a streak of hydraulic fluid from her brow, leaving a dark smear. "If Command's given up, then they won't mind what I try on this one." Garcia glanced at her, concern flickering across his face. "You really want to risk your record for a lost cause? Court-martial's a real possibility, Santos." She ignored the warning, scanning the scrap pile again. An Apache's rotor linkage, a Kiowa's tail section, a Humvee's armored doornun designed for a UH-60, all potentially useful. She weighed each option, the urgency pressing in on her with every tick of Harrington's watch. Maria stood, jaw set. "If I don't try, I'll answer for more than a busted career." She reached for the plasma cutter, the tool's blue arc sparking to life and casting harsh shadows across the hangar floor. Garcia stepped back, muttering about reckless decisions. 2 junior mechanics paused, their usual routine forgotten as they watched their by-the-book chief prepare to ignore every regulation. Maria lowered her welding mask and braced herself, the cutter's whine rising as she sliced into the first ruined panel. Metal shrieked, sparks rained down, and the damaged sections dropped to the floor one by one. The maintenance log remained untouched behind the glass office door. There would be no official record, no sign-off, no inspection. Maria worked in silence, surrounded by mismatched components and skeptical eyes, determined to give the Black Hawk a fighting chance. As the last sparks faded, Maria wiped her hands and scanned the hangar, her gaze settling on the line of wrecked vehicles. The next step would require more than skill. It would demand resourcefulness, speed, and a willingness to break every rule she'd ever followed. Maria moved through the hangar, her headlamp cutting across battered hulls and scattered debris. She approached the Apache's wreck, quickly noting the fuel lines narrower than the Blackhawk's, but the rubber looked sound. With practiced hands, she freed the segments, tucking them under her arm without hesitation. Her focus shifted to the Humvee's driver's side door leaning against the wall. She pressed her fingers to the steel, gauging its weight and thickness, silently calculating how much the mounting brackets could bear if she reinforced them. The door scraped across the concrete as she dragged it to her work area, the sound echoing in the cavernous bay. 2 corporals watched as Maria welded the salvaged steel onto the Black Hawk's exposed starboard side. The Humvee plating overlapped the original armor by 3 inches, just enough to keep the structure sound while leaving clearance for the rotor. Sparks flickered around her boots, illuminating the sweat on her brow and the set of her jaw. She worked steadily, aware that every minute spent here was another minute Alpha Team waited in the ravine. A leak near the tail rotor caught her eye, hydraulic fluid seeping from a makeshift joint. Maria pulled a half-used pack of spearmint gum from her pocket, chewed 3 pieces, and pressed the sticky wad into the junction. Like patching a wound with tape, she hoped the gum would hold in flight. One of the corporals muttered about regulations, but Maria ignored him, wiping her hands on her coveralls and moving on. She refused to see her comrades left as bait. The maintenance logbook remained closed on the chief's desk. Official procedure demanded every repair be logged, every part tagged and approved. Maria didn't have the time or the authorization. She scribbled torque specs on her forearm with a grease pencil, focused only on the next step. At 217, she started the engine. The modified exhaust spat sparks across the hangar floor, briefly igniting oil stains. Maria adjusted the fuel mixture, turning the screw until the engine's rhythm steadied. The sound drew Chief Garcia across the bay, his voice sharp as he demanded an explanation for the unauthorized test. "They're prepping court-martial paperwork as we speak," he warned. Maria didn't look up, tightening a bolt with measured precision. "They won't need those forms if this bird saves Alpha Team." Her voice was steady, her hands sure. Garcia snatched the wrench from her. "That exhaust mod violates 3 NATOPS manuals. You think I'm risking my pension for your cowboy engineering?" She wiped her forehead, eyes on her work. "Chief, those boys in the ravine? They've got wives checking clocks right now, kids waiting for calls that won't come." She took the wrench back, voice low. "Tell Jag I did this alone after you relieved me. But let me finish first." Garcia stared at the patched helicopter welds gleaming, armor mismatched, hydraulic lines rerouted. He paused, then tossed her a tube of industrial sealant. "Gum won't hold past 5,000 feet." As he walked away, he told the night crew to bring more lights to her station. Maria pressed the sealant into her pocket, eyes flicking to the clock. She checked her repairs once more, the hangar quiet except for the hum of distant generators. In the silence, she listened for the next order, hands poised above the last critical connection. At 400, the radio issued command's final directive. All repair efforts were to cease immediately. Maria's wrench hovered above the fuel line, tension growing in the stillness as the order repeated, clinical and absolute. The mechanics around her exchanged glances, their hands falling to their sides. The hum of the hangar lights seemed louder now, filling the space left by the sudden halt in activity. Captain Harrington's silhouette appeared in the doorway, her flight suit creased, exhaustion etched into her face. She lingered in the shadows, watching Maria at work. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, barely carrying over the distant generator. "My friend's brother is in that ravine." The admission hung between them, a quiet plea that cut through the regulation's cold logic. Maria's gaze dropped to the half-finished splice at her feet. She'd memorized the manual Severy directive said to ground the helicopter, to wait for authorized parts and depot-level inspection. The open maintenance log on her toolbox was a silent accusation, its blank lines waiting for entries that would never be written. All her training insisted she stop. But the memory of Alpha Team waiting, the image of 23 lives on the line, weighed heavier than any rule. Chief Garcia strode down the aisle, the clatter of his keys marking his approach. He paused at the tool cabinet, eyes on Maria. "You heard the order." One by one, he locked away the tool wrenches, meters, anything with a tag. His actions bought Maria a few more moments, but also made the stakes clear. She knew disciplinary orders were being drawn up. The Blackhawk stood beneath the harsh lights, patched armor welded from Humvee doors, lines sealed with gum and desperation. Maria's fingers lingered on a fuel gauge scavenged from a Chinook, its needles stubbornly in the red. Without the proper tools, each adjustment became a gamble. The protocols demanded she walk away, but the need for action pressed in from every side. Garcia pocketed his keys and left, his departure final. Maria watched his shadow slip around the corner, toward the offices where consequences were already taking shape. Captain Harrington remained, leaning against the workbench, her gaze tracing the helicopter's battered frame. "I won't ask you to break regs," she said, her hand resting on a scar along the tail boom. "But if you happen to leave the cockpit door unlocked after your shift..." Maria reached beneath the floor panel and pulled out a battered toolbox, no official tags, just decades of undocumented fixes scrawled in its margins. Inside, salvaged connectors, mismatched bolts, and a notebook of handwritten field repairs waited. She cut a gasket from heat-resistant blanket, measured by touch, and Harrington pressed the flange in place as Maria tightened the bolts. The hangar felt suspended in time, the outside world reduced to distant radio chatter and the faint pulse of GPS signals over the mountains. The final piece was a fuel flow restrictor, improvised from a damaged throttle linkage. It wasn't in any manual, and it might fail at altitude. Still, as Maria snapped it into place, the pressure gauge steadied, and for the first time that night, the repairs seemed possible. Harrington checked her watch. "Lift off in 20, or we lose daylight advantage." She turned away, heading for the lockers. Maria stayed with the Blackhawk, listening to the engine's uneven idle, the patched systems holding together under the glare. A jeep rolled up outside, headlights sweeping across the hangar doors. Maria slid the toolbox back into hiding, wiped her hands, and waited. If anyone asked, her work area would show only regulation gear. The true extent of her modifications, and the risks she'd taken, would remain hidden for now. The hangar lights flickered overhead, shadows lengthening across the concrete, as Maria prepared for what came next. Maria settled into her work, hands steady despite the pressure. Midnight found her crouched beneath the battered Blackhawk, grafting hardened steel tracks to reinforce the belly, each segment measured and cut with care. She pulled titanium panels from a wrecked Kiowa, welding them alongside the Humvee armor she'd already mounted. Each addition increased the weight, but leaving the fuel cell exposed was not an option. She worked quickly, eyes darting to the clock, knowing every pound could mean the difference between survival and disaster. She fitted 2 fuel filters scavenged from a grounded Chinook into the fuel line, grinding their housings to match the Blackhawk's specs. These makeshift pressure regulators weren't meant for this engine, and she scratched new pressure ratings into the metal with an awl. Every fix created new problems. The modified exhaust system, baffles bent and realigned, now vented heat downward into the landing skids. The tail assembly creaked under the new stress, and Maria adjusted the baffles again, knowing the irregular thermal plume might confuse heat-seeking missiles, but could trigger engine warnings at altitude. That erratic heat plume would make SAM operators hesitate, forcing them to question what they were seeing. Her hands moved on autopilot, each motion practiced but tense. She wiped a streak of grease across her forehead, not noticing the blood from a wrench slip until it trickled down her cheek. The pain barely registered. She remembered Kandaharisking her career, betting everything on a patchwork fix that saved a reconnaissance team pinned by mortar fire. She'd carried that memory into every impossible repair since. By 530, the first grey light filtered through the hangar's windows. The Blackhawk looked nothing like its original self. Rivet patterns broke midline where she'd replaced fuselage sections. Weld marks ran along the skin, some still hot to the touch. The exhaust ports jutted at odd angles, turbulence curling through the morning mist. The aircraft's infrared signature, once a bright target, now bloomed unpredictably from the new baffles. Any missile operator scanning for standard heat signatures would find only confusion. Chief Garcia approached, taking in the blood on Maria's face and the pile of discarded parts. He tossed her a fresh welding mask, his face unreadable. "You're either the bravest or stupidest mechanic I've ever met." He crouched beside the Blackhawk, tracing the Chinook filter housings, pausing at her pressure notations. Maria winced as she adjusted her grip on the mask. "It'll hold long enough," she said, nodding toward the engines. Garcia circled the aircraft, checking every weld and borrowed component. At the tail, he tested the tension on spliced control cables, his fingers coming away black with graphite. "They're calling the families now," he said, voice low. "Command's writing letters." Maria tightened a hydraulic coupling, the warm fluid slick on her hands. Not if that bird flies. Outside, the morning shift gathered, murmurs rising as they noticed the altered Blackhawk. Radios hissed with updates from Alpha Team's last known position. Garcia pressed a wrench into Maria's palm. If this ends badly, you'll answer for it. He moved toward the crowd, drawing attention away. Maria turned back to the aircraft, wiping her bloody fingerprints from the fuel gauge as she made final checks. The first missile battery was already active near the trapped soldiers. Every sensor on the field searched for a familiar target. Maria's work ensured they would not find one. The modified Blackhawk waited on the tarmac, rotors spinning against the chill as dawn crept over the mountains. The engine's unfamiliar whine cut through the air, higher and sharper than any ground crew remembered. Dozens of violations crawled through the pre-flight checklist: fuel system irregularities, mismatched hydraulics, armor bolted from 3 different vehicles. Captain Harrington closed the binder, her face unreadable behind the cockpit glass. She glanced at Maria, then fastened her harness in silence. The ground crew clustered near the hangar doors, tension showing in the way they shifted their weight and avoided eye contact. The launch was unauthorized, the aircraft not airworthy by any standard. One corporal kept glancing at the command building, expecting alarms to sound and officers to rush the flight line. Maria moved through the cabin, settling behind the portside crew seat, a wrench still jutting from her pocket. She pressed her palm to the bulkhead, feeling every vibration as the engines reached speed. Chief Garcia stood by the fuel pumps, his salute crisp and wordless a silent acknowledgement of the risk Maria was taking, and a gesture of respect that needed no explanation. As the Blackhawk rolled forward, the modified exhaust spat irregular plumes across the concrete. The altered baffles redirected heat down into the skids, masking the helicopter's thermal profile. The quiet pass would later register no clear contacts on enemy scopes. Maria's modifications forced the aircraft to sound and appear as nothing familiar, a ghost slipping into the pre-dawn haze. Inside the cockpit, Harrington ran through the last of the system checks. The instrument panel flashed warnings: uneven lift, pressure anomalies, fuel flow outside safe parameters. She tapped each system warning off, trusting Maria's makeshift fixes over the computer's protests. The controls vibrated with every adjustment, the aircraft's weight distribution thrown off by the patchwork armor. Harrington's grip tightened on the cyclic. She glanced back at Maria, who was already monitoring the jury-rigged gauges and checking the welded seams for stress. Hydraulic fluid gathered in a slow drip near Maria's boot, leaking from the chewing gum seal she'd pressed into place. She pressed 2 fingers against the line, counting the seconds, calculating how much time they had before the pressure would drop. Every detail mattered. The Chinook filters pulsed under the strain, the welded titanium and Humvee panels groaning as they lifted off. The Blackhawk rose from the ground with a shudder, loose tools rattling in their compartments. The ground crew watched in silence, their faces drawn with worry and a kind of pride. Garcia's hand lingered at his brow until the aircraft cleared the perimeter lights. Above the airfield, the modified exhaust created ripples in the cold air, distorting the helicopter's shape against the sky. Enemy radar, scanning for standard signatures, would find only scattered echoes and shifting blurs. The cockpit filled with the low hum of warnings, but Harrington kept her focus on the ridgeline ahead, each flick of her thumb silencing another alert. Maria stayed low in the rear compartment, eyes on her makeshift instruments, ready to intervene if anything faltered. Her presence violated every protocol, but she would not leave the outcome to chance. The unauthorized launch faded from the base's radio chatter, the aircraft's sound profile already swallowed by the terrain. As the Blackhawk banked toward the first mountain pass, turbulence shook the cabin and the warning lights began to multiply. Maria steadied herself, watching the altimeter climb. The next test would come as they crossed into enemy territory, where every fix would be measured against incoming fire. Missile lock warnings flickered across the battered cockpit displays as the Blackhawk skirted the edge of a narrow mountain corridor, where enemy anti-aircraft guns struggled to find a clear angle. Maria scanned the threat indicators, watching 3 separate tracking systems light up and then blink out of sequence. The exhaust modifications scattered the helicopter's heat signature in unpredictable bursts, and the first missile veered off into the rocks, its guidance lost in the confusion. Inside, the unusual engine harmonics filled the cabin, a byproduct of the modified fuel mixture and battered components. The distorted whine bounced between the canyon walls, and ground patrols below reported multiple aircraft overhead. Enemy spotters hesitated, unable to match the sound or shape to anything familiar. Captain Harrington's voice cut through the static, her tone steady despite the chaos. "Santos, talk to me. Are we holding together?" Maria pressed her palm to the jury-rigged gauge, the salvaged Chinook part trembling near the danger zone. But the needle didn't drop. The first RPG slammed into the starboard armor Humvee steel welded over the fuel cell. The impact jolted every bolt in the fuselage, but the improvised plating absorbed the blast. Tools rattled loose. Warning lights blinked, but the armor held. Maria reinforced each gum seal with tape on the fly as fluid dripped around her boots, the chewing gum ballooning under pressure, but refusing to fail. One hydraulic line leaked steadily, the gum turning glassy from friction, but she kept the flow steady, never leaving her station. Navigation screens had shattered on takeoff, so Harrington relied on memory, threading the Blackhawk through passes barely wider than its rotors. The aircraft turned tighter than any standard Blackhawk would dare, the altered weight distribution granting unnatural agility but making stalls more likely. Maria's hands moved from gauge to gauge, tracking every system pushed past its rated limits. Multiple impacts registered as they neared the extraction point. Each new hit triggered a fresh system warning. When a power reduction alert tried to shut down the engines, Maria jammed a screwdriver into the override, holding the thrust steady. The engines screamed, but the helicopter pressed on. On final approach, fuel pressure dipped into the red. Maria reached between the seats, manually adjusting the flow through the improvised restrictor, her skin burning against hot metal. The engines stabilized, just as Harrington flared for landing. Bullets glanced off the tail as Alpha Team scrambled aboard. One round snapped a control cable Maria had spliced from scavenged parts, but Harrington compensated, keeping the Blackhawk stable with quick adjustments. As they climbed out, more missile locks broke contact, the exhaust modifications flaring unpredictably and confusing enemy tracking. Hydraulic fluid pooled under Maria's boots, held back by gum and tape. System alarms blared, but the aircraft responded. Ground crews would later find ammunition embedded in the engine housing, stopped just short of critical systems by Maria's non-regulation armor. The Blackhawk touched down with the timer still running, its hull pitted and scarred. Maria's hands shook as she adjusted the fuel mixture for the last time, watching the makeshift gauges flicker. The chewing gum seals had melted to a sticky paste, but they had lasted through the worst of it. The aircraft's engines wound down, leaving only the echo of their passage and the uncertainty that filled the empty space they'd left behind. In the maintenance bay, dawn brought a stillness that felt unnatural. Chief Garcia paced the length of the oil-stained floor, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the Blackhawk should have been. 90 minutes had passed since radar contact vanished. With each step, the weight of what was expected pressed down casualty reports, queued on the command center's old computer, a junior officer hesitating before finalizing the notifications. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the quiet shifting of ground crew who had been up all night, waiting for word. Then, a sound cut through the quiet uneven, metallic, not quite right. Ground crew straightened, radar operators leaned forward, and Garcia stopped mid-stride. The contact on the screen was faint, intermittent, unlike anything in the database. The noise grew louder, uncertain at first, then resolving into the battered rhythm of a helicopter that had no business returning. All eyes turned to the eastern approach. The Blackhawk appeared from behind a lingering veil of smoke, its silhouette warped by damage. Armor plating hung in jagged strips, exposing the mismatched Humvee and Kiowa panels that had survived the mission. Bullet holes marked the tail in a diagonal line, and a rotor blade bent at an angle that defied normal flight. The exhaust system vented smoke in irregular plumes, masking the aircraft's identity even as it touched down. The landing skids groaned under the unfamiliar load, Hydraulic fluid streaked the fuselage, and as the rotors slowed, a wrench clattered to the floor. Someone had dropped it in disbelief. The ground crew gathered in silence, their faces a mix of relief and shock. The cabin door was open, but the interior was empty. No pilot emerged. No rescued soldiers stepped out. Instead, a sealed envelope and a thumb drive sat on the co-pilot's seat, placed where command would find them first. The note inside contained a brief report and coordinates for the extraction, along with a list of field modifications performed unsigned, but written in the careful block letters of someone who knew every regulation by heart. Chief Garcia approached the aircraft, his boots leaving dark prints on the concrete as he circled the battered frame. He picked up a twisted shard of metal from the landing gear and turned it over in his hand. The smell of cordite and burnt oil lingered. The ground crew began their assessment, counting bullet holes, tracing welds, and cataloging each unauthorized fix. They worked quietly, aware that every mark told its own story. 3 officers from command arrived soon after, their uniforms crisp and their faces unreadable. They avoided the largest oil stains as they moved around the helicopter, clipboards in hand, taking notes on the modifications and the improvised armor. One paused at the exhaust baffles, pen hovering but not writing anything down. The aircraft's condition was impossible to explain by the book. Garcia glanced at the empty cockpit, then at the envelope now in the hands of the lead officer. He said nothing. The maintenance team continued their work, documenting damage and salvaging what they could. The absence of crew or passengers left questions hanging in the air, questions no one was eager to answer. In the command center, the casualty notifications were quietly deleted, one line at a time. The radar screen updated, showing a single Blackhawk icon where none had been expected. As the morning shift filtered in, the story of the aircraft's return began to spread quietly, with a kind of reverence reserved for things that defy logic. The hangar doors remained open, the battered helicopter at the center of it all. No one spoke of protocol or blame. There was only the evidence left behind. A machine pushed past its limits, a mission completed against all odds, and the knowledge that some stories would never make it into the official record. Soon reports would be filed, and the routine would resume. But for those who witnessed the return, the details would linger unspoken, but impossible to forget. After the Blackhawk's return, the official after-action report filled 3 pages with praise for Captain Harrington's piloting. The document detailed evasive maneuvers, low-level flight beneath radar, and a precise landing in contested terrain. It described the aircraft as fully operational per maintenance logs, a claim that no one directly challenged. Nowhere did it mention the Humvee door welded over the fuel cell, the titanium panels cut from a Kiowa, or the field repairs that kept the fuel system sealed with gum and tape. The technical section quietly omitted any reference to non-standard parts or battlefield improvisation. Maria reported back to her regular maintenance shift the next morning. Her confiscated toolbox reappeared at her workstation, lock scored with fresh scratches and every regulation tool in its place. Under the wrench tray, a thin dusting of graphite powder lingered enough to hint at unofficial help, but not enough to draw questions if anyone checked fluid samples. The message was clear: keep working, but keep it quiet. Within 48 hours, command ordered the damaged Blackhawk removed from site. A crew loaded it onto a flatbed truck after midnight, its serial number freshly painted over. The paperwork listed the destination as depot-level evaluation, but the transport manifest soon vanished from the system. No one asked about the armor welded from vehicle scrap, or why the exhaust system was missing baffles. The aircraft disappeared into the supply chain, its story scrubbed from official records. 2 weeks later, Maria found a manila envelope taped inside her locker. Inside were blueprints for an experimental exhaust baffle, nearly identical to her field modification but drawn to engineering standards. A single handwritten line at the bottom read, "Next time, use these." The handwriting was blocky, unfamiliar, and unsigned. The blueprints bore no classification stamp, no identifying marks, just the quiet assurance that someone was paying attention. Captain Harrington's orders came soon after. Reassignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The paperwork cited exceptional airmanship under fire, omitting any mention of the unauthorized launch or the details of the mission. Her new unit commander later told colleagues he'd specifically requested the pilot who flew that Frankenstein Blackhawk out of Pakistan, but the official record left out the reason why. In the maintenance bay, Chief Garcia stopped writing up Maria's protocol deviations. When she used non-standard parts on a C-130's hydraulic system, he initialed the work order without a word. During tool inventories, he marked her box as compliant, never mind the extra weight. The message was unspoken but understood. Some rules could be bent for results that mattered. The soldiers from Alpha Team received standard debriefings. They never learned who rebuilt their ride or how close they'd come to being stranded. Any questions about the rough flight or the strange engine noise were brushed aside. The focus stayed on the mission's success and the pilot's skill. As months passed, Maria's innovations quietly spread. Crew chiefs in other units began to ask for her input on field repairs. Blueprints and handwritten notes circulated among trusted mechanics. The official logs never reflected these changes, but aircraft patched using her methods kept flying when others would have been grounded. Recognition never came in the form of medals or ceremonies. Instead, it lived in the quiet nods from fellow mechanics, the silent approval of a chief who stopped asking questions, and the knowledge that, sometimes, the difference between failure and survival depended on hands willing to break the rules for the right reasons. For Maria, that was enough. Staff Sergeant Santos still works midnight shifts at FOB Echo, her name quietly passed along by those who know the importance of a steady hand in the dark. The mechanic's code runs deeper than any checklist. It's a culture of quiet professionalism, where the hum of a well-tuned engine means more than any medal on a uniform. Maria's satisfaction came from the way a rotor blade cut cleanly through the air after a night of impossible repairs, and in the knowledge that a machine she'd rebuilt could bring people home when nothing else would. Her story moved through maintenance bays in fragments, carried by word of mouth and the silent respect of those who understood what it meant to improvise under fire. Young mechanics started stashing spearmint gumdust, like Maria used on those leaks alongside their multi-tools. They copied her habit of marking torque specs on their forearms with grease pencil, and they memorized the shape of welds that held together when the manual said they shouldn't. Her innovations spoke louder than medals ever could. The modified exhaust baffle she designed in a moment of desperation later appeared in prototype schematics for advanced helicopters. Official documents never mentioned her name, but in the field, her work became the standard. It started when Chief Garcia quietly stopped writing her up, and soon after, pilots began asking for Santos certified aircraft without needing to explain why. The phrase spread, a shorthand for repairs that would hold under the worst conditions, trusted by those who understood what was at stake. No ceremony marked her achievements. Official commendations praised Captain Harrington's flying, omitting the details of the Blackhawk's condition and the field repairs that made the mission possible. Command quietly reassigned the damaged helicopter, its records edited to erase any trace of Maria's handiwork. Still, within the informal network of maintainers, her reputation grew. Veterans pointed out the legend's details to new recruits, passing down dog-eared notebooks with sketches of the impossible Blackhawk, the one that flew with tank track armor and Apache fuel filters. No one disputed the chewing gum. The mechanic's code isn't written down. It's learned in the way crews approach a Chinook with a missing part, or when they measure twice and cut once, using whatever scrap is at hand. Quartermasters noticed certain items vanished more often: sections of armor plating, odd bolts, graphite smudges on work orders, but said nothing. The culture Garcia set years aga-trusting the hands that kept aircraft flying spread to other units, embedding mechanics like Maria with forward teams. Their titles stayed the same, but their expertise became the difference between failure and survival. The soldiers who boarded that Blackhawk never knew whose hands rebuilt the aircraft. Some noticed the odd welds, others remembered the engine's offbeat whine, but all that mattered was that the bird flew when every manual said it couldn't. Maria's hands remained steady, her attention focused on the next inspection, never lingering on old stories. When new mechanics ask about the legend, She just points to the aircraft in front of her and reminds them where their real work begins. In maintenance bays from Afghanistan to the Balkans, crews still debate which parts of the tale are true. They agree on one thing: when the manual says something's impossible, that's when real mechanics start working. In every military operation, the spotlight rarely finds the hands that keep the mission alive. Maria's midnight modifications remind us that every daring rescue depends on more than just the pilot's courage. There's always someone behind the scenes. The next time you hear about a successful extraction, think of the mechanic working by flashlight or the medic patching wounds under fire that nobody mentions. Recognition often misses those who solve problems no manual covers. When the official record stops short, real missions are won by the quiet experts in the shadows. Remember Maria's story. When the manual says impossible, real mechanics start working. If stories of unsung heroes resonate with you, consider subscribing for more.